Then I would like to pose Catherine's question to our three speakers. So how can we, with our modern concepts of nature and what nature is, how can we, or can we actually um, access the idea of nature in ancient texts? Would you, either of you, Christopher, Laura, and Lynn, would you like to comment upon that?
Well, it's been, or that's a question that I've been grappling with for a long time now. Obviously, I grappled with this quite a bit today as well, because as I mentioned, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to look. I mean, the modern technology would allow for that, to take a sort of a text, a digital text, Pausanias, for instance, description of Greece, and then type in physis and look for sort of the definitions of physis or whatever words you can think of that have to do with nature. But I think then you would miss out on a lot of the more sort of let's say relevant passages, in fact, where he's not actually talking that much about the landscape in front of him. This is actually something that's been discussed a lot in the research regarding this author from ancient Greece, where a lot of the travelers of the 19th century, they took, of course, the description of Greece with them to the Greek mainland, and then they wrote about their own experiences there, and then they wondered, okay, it's interesting what Pausanias writes about the topography, or probably the cultural traditions that we can find the archaeological sites, but there is not that much in the way of landscape description. So they added that to themselves. But this was sort of born of a, I would say highly romanticized sentiment in the 19th century. I mean, when we come back to what Catherine has said in her introduction, in fact, this notion of nature, this is also something that I mentioned in my talk. I mean, Jacques Derrida has famously sort of differentiated between a nature with a capital N that he calls the fantasy. This is sort of something that can be historically analyzed. This is something the big out there, but this is all kind of a textual sort of construction. And so he deconstructed that. And many people have sort of only taken this part of the argument and not sort of seen that he actually has also the small notion of nature there as well. So nature with a low letter, and I think that this is actually more of the sort of this. The question should be, okay, what is this actually? This sort of understanding of nature, and how can we actually look for it? And my approach today was to look at instances where I felt like Pausanias was sort of immersed in the landscape, in the sense that he became part of everything that was around him, especially the fluid terrain, as I call it, the water. So water as an element. In fact, I mean, there's also a lot of literature, of course, about elemental philosophy and sort of elemental literature, how that has been part actually of the imaginative world making from antiquity onwards. This is actually an instance where it suddenly becomes interesting to see, okay, he's probably not that much interested in this panoramic views, sort of the sublime view of Greece, although some scholars would argue that he has that as well, but he's probably also zooming into the landscape, into the small little parts that are there, and that kind of make up this whole sort of interactive sort of environment. I mean, if we look for a word that probably is also usable in this context, will probably be environment, although that is also a little bit hierarchical and then puts sort of the human a little bit in the center. But I think that this is also an important notion, and to think about these different, alternatives, as I said, but also not to shy away, in fact, from asking questions like Pausanias, is he somehow a nature writer? How does he react to the experiences that he sees? And yeah, so this is part, I guess, of my my answer, first part. I mean, I could say a lot more, but then I would take up too much time, and I first have to probably organize my thoughts a little bit better.
Thank you very much. Diana has asked to make a comment, but before I give her liberty to do so, I just ask if Lynn and Laura, if there's something you'd like to add to this. I mean, I know you're not primarily studying ancient cultures, but you're still sort of active in a reading and interpretation a community that is based on texts that come from ancient times. So you may have some thoughts to add here as well.
If I may, yes,
Of course.
thank you. Thank you. Well, of course, I'm mainly looking at the contemporary environmentalism, and that derives its religious sources from the Quran and Hadith that kind of goes back to the 7th century. So no, we are not, or I'm not mainly working at the ancient texts, but this question of how to grasp the old text, I guess that's relevant for me as well. And I kind of like to think that it's about interpretation or reinterpretation, if we want to see it that way. And what came to my mind was, for example, Nasser that I mentioned in the presentation, how he goes back and looks at what does Sharia actually contain. And he goes back to the very basics of Sharia, the very basic things, how to treat one another, to minimize waste and so on. And then according to him, if we don't have kind of the strong roots in our thinking, we cannot develop functioning environmental laws. So there we do have the connection from the old text right at the modern time. So that was some thoughts that came to my mind.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Lynn, would you like?
I'd like to, yes. So, I mean, I think my whole entry back into Judaism as an adult was connected to not so much the text, but the whole thing that there was this rhythmic, that this whole thing of the calendar and the rhythms of the year. And I was studying to be an astrologer, and then I went into Kabbalah, and through the mystics, I could very much feel and sense what they were talking about, because it was something that I could experience. And I think to me today, and I obviously also through my rabbinic studies, I've studied the Torah texts, very intensely. And I sense it's almost like I can sense how the ancients must have, it's almost been like this, like you're a part of it all, and you pray because this is so much connected to who you are and what you're doing, and it's interconnected. And I think that's what, for me, also what we're maybe needing to go back to, this kind of sensing that, we're not separate. This is just the head that's separating us from reality. We are water, we are earth, we are spirit, we are everything. And the more we are connected from within, we're also connecting with everything. So I think that goes through any understanding I have of any text or anything I do. So that's, yes.
Very interesting. Okay, so Diana is joining us all the way from California, so we should probably say good morning.
Yes. I've been up very early this morning. I just want to sort of pick up and thank you all for these very interesting papers on what you had said, Anna. That was my sort of initial reaction, and some of the feedback already has addressed this. But what we have in these religious traditions, particularly Islam, the sacred texts are reflecting a very different worldview than we live in today. So on the one hand, I can understand a faith community wanting to reinterpret and update texts, but we also have an ecological movement one that is quite secular that isn't based on the religious text. And I guess I sort of want to ask the question or reflect over, are there any dangers inherent in trying to mine religious texts for modern ecological ideas or concepts of living in harmony or what has to happen in nature when they had such different worldviews? Is it possible to really update these in a responsible way? And are there any dangers? Or is it, and also simultaneously, for those who just come at this from our own culture and don't necessarily want to involve religion as part of the answer, do they miss out on something? And can both of those approaches work together and come up with similar solutions that will help everyone? So just what people's reflections might be over any aspect of that.
Well, if I may, I'd like to jump in here, and then please, anyone who has a reflection or a comment, please do so as well. But I was thinking along the same lines, actually, when I heard your presentation, Laura, that you mentioned Lynn White and his by now infamous article on Judeo-Christian influence on the ecological crisis, and how it's really interesting to look back now to, I think it was published in '68, how that article sparked a flurry in a way of exegesis, biblical exegesis, both in Jewish and Christian circles, but I think primarily in Christian at first, perhaps, where there are many, many attempts at mining ancient texts, as you say, Diana, for answers, guidance, contents that in a way counter Lynn White's accusations, and these are done in different ways. Some are more sensitive than others, and I was just curious in a way to ask you, Laura, if there is a similar response in Quranic exegesis, both academic and non-academic, to try to counter a criticism such as Lynn White's with a sort of an exegesis. In Christian Hebrew Bible exegesis, we have someone like the Australian Old Testament scholar Norman Havel, who has published a lot since roughly 2000, and who talks about greening ancient texts, so reading them with a green intention. And he says there are some texts that are just gray. We can't do anything about those. We can't greenwash them, but there are texts that we can greenwash and should greenwash. And he's one example of an exegete who's doing things like this. Do you have similar examples in Quranic exegesis?
Well, thank you for these comments and questions. I hope I can shed some light on it. It's a big question, but of course I can only answer according to my own research and what I've seen and met. So most likely there's more to add, but yes, there are. Or how should I address this? If we answer, or if we start with the question that is there counter criticism, both yes and no. It's for a very long time, or let's say there has been kind of a common view to think that the environmental destruction is all the fault of the Western world. And there's even been thoughts presented that the whole idea of climate change and that we need to work together, and it's a new way to impose a Western imperialism on the Muslim world. So there has definitely been a way, like how should I say, like that the West, sorry, I tried to say so much, so let's see, let's start from the beginning. So there has definitely been like well, if not discourses, but voices at least that are trying to say that we should just close the Muslim world from the West, that this is just something that it's imposed on us once again. But then there are definitely Muslim scholars, but also Muslims on the grassroots level that are saying that we are in this boat together. It doesn't matter who caused what. The fact is that we need to work together, because otherwise this boat will sink, and the Muslims with the boat, whether we want to acknowledge our own responsibility or not. And yes, so this was just a short answer. I hope it might be that something more comes to my mind, but if somebody else wants to comment in between, feel free.
Excellent, and feel free to come back.
Mm.
And I got a couple of comments here on the chat. As mentioning, John Woodhouse mentions that, of course, Pope Francis has been doing a bit of green exegesis himself in Laudato Si, and also another comment mentioning the Patriarch Bartholomew of the Orthodox Church. So this is something that is happening both within faith communities, as you mentioned, Diana, but also in the academic world outside. But Diana, do you have a suggestion as to how this can be done?
No, I mean, I haven't really, reflected on this. It just strikes me, I suppose right now, the shock of having moved back to the US and being in the midst of Trump land and all of this rise of conservative Christians, so that everything, Bible thumping is becoming much more prevalent, along with, human thumping at riots and all sorts of stuff that's going on here. It's really crazy. But being back here where you have such a strong conservative Christian group that is raising its head and voice because of Trump and with Trump and in support of Trump, it just strikes me more, this is, to me, it becomes more prominent that people are turning to the Bible for solutions. And I understand that is a way of life within, conservative ends of most faith communities. I guess I'm sort of happy that at least they're looking at these issues. They're taking an issue that is very current today that wasn't really current before, except for natural disasters, perhaps. And they are trying to give some answers. But the question, for me, the question is, are they going to get they can satisfy themselves that God may have had a plan or, accounted for these possibilities. But the question to me is, what policies will come out of this, if any? I mean, can there be action? And that's what's interesting about the Islamic thing. You actually have some of these statements and policies that are being put in place. And it would just be very interesting to see how different those ones are from what more secular groups that aren't, scripturally based are proposing. Are they coming up with similar proposals, or are they coming up with different proposals? And is it possible to implement them? Or because man was put in charge, is it okay? Whatever we do to the environment, even if we screw it up, that's what we were supposed to do because God ordained us to do that. I mean, so it'd be kind of interesting. I know we only had 3 papers and there's only so much space and time, but it would be very interesting. That's what sort of comes to my mind as a real question. Are there any ultimate differences here, whether you're mining the Bible or not, for practical action today to address what we perceive as these ecological issues?
Mm. Thank you. Well, there is another thing that came up a couple of times during our 3 presentations and also in Catherine's introduction. And this is the question. I'm moving on a little bit from the hermeneutical challenge in a way, and we can return to this. I'm thinking of the hermeneutical challenge of the text view of nature as opposed to ours. But this is the question of how do we perceive nature? Is it another? Is nature the other, or are we part of it somehow? And I was intrigued by what you said, Christopher, about this question of nature writing as a literary response to the non-human world, and in a way, it actually reminded me of Bruno Latour and his actor network theory, which is perhaps a bit meta to draw in here, but there is something in Latour's work where he says that by acknowledging non-human agents as actors in social networks, he acknowledges, and he sort of gives us a theoretical language to describe how we interact with our surroundings, and in a way, in a less theoretical way, this was also to a certain extent, I think, what you were describing in your reading of Pausanias, and something that's always been tricky, because this is nature, ecology, and religion, of course, and something that's always been tricky about Bruno Latour is where we put gods. Where do they belong in the actor network theory? Where do they belong in the system, in the network? And in his early work, he said the gods are not a part of this because they're made up, because that was the world he was describing. So non-supernatural beings do not belong here. But he changed his view on this, and he actually eventually permitted supernatural beings such as gods and ghosts and demons into his actor network. And I'm really curious to see if this makes sense for you to introduce this concept, and also how does this translate to your talk about sort of responding to the non-human world? Where do the gods fit into this? You said it, you mentioned it a couple of times, how Pausanias is deeply religious, but would you spell it out a little bit more, how the world of the divine fits into to this whole thing?
Yes, thank you for this intriguing question. And you're right. Of course, I draw a lot on post-human philosophy, not necessarily Latour, but other philosophers, sort of in that vein, who have to, or in that tradition, who come from a sort of new materialist background. This is my way, I guess, of somehow circumventing or evading, this problem of the capital nature, because these people, as you mentioned, for instance, Latour, they have a somewhat different outlook on the world, where sort of this dichotomy between nature and culture does not hold, because we have different sort of assemblages or networks or whatever or landscapes of porosity, as I call them, where we have just different agents and different sort of presences that come together, and that literature, of course, then draws on, or that also, I guess, religious texts describe in their narrative fabrics. And well, where does divinity come into play in my reading of Pausanias? He is very much interested in, of course, local traditions to gods and all kind of divine matters. There's actually no passage or no page that goes by without him naming different deities or local nymphs or whatever. So this is very, very important to him. And it seems to me personally that he reads the Greek mythological tradition that has been around for 1,000 years when he writes his own text, that he uses this as a kind of repository, on the one hand, of cultural memory, so that he can explain his readers or to himself what kind of sights he's seeing. And then he sort of also, writes down the local stories, local histories, but also sort of the textbook knowledge that he certainly possessed, I think. And I think it's a way he uses these stories of the Greeks, as he sometimes calls them, these logoi, and these mythological sort of parts of his text, in a lot of ways to make sense of these myths. So there is a strong, I think, paradigm in studies on the description of Greece that focuses on the allegorical readings that Pausanias brings to the way he perceives the landscape. So he will describe the myth of a certain god, and then he will somehow step back from this myth and treat it like I treated him, in a way, as a piece to interpret. And he often does that with taking sort of a recurse or drawing connections with the natural environment. So he will say, okay, you know, the god Apollo is worshipped by the Athenians and this Deimos because he will free them of certain plagues. And then he will explain that in his home country, he actually was not from the Greek mainland, but from Asia Minor, so in modern Turkey, Manisa in modern Turkey. And he will then explain that in his own home country, he has seen 3 occasions when locusts were sort of wiped out by storms or by a terrible cold. And then he sort of makes or comes up with an explanation for or why the Greeks on the mainland tell this myth of Apollo, the god of the sun, or of actually many things, why he is worshipped in such a scenario where you have a natural disaster occurring, and why certain powers or actions that are associated with a god, with a deity, are sort of invoked by a community. So he has sometimes a very, you could say, rationalizing gaze. But in my reading of him, it's interesting that this is often done with taking sort of a look at the natural history. It's not just the cultural history, but also the natural history. And this is, I think that, I mean, there is a very famous passage in the 8th book on Arcadia, where he says that up until this point, until he came to Arcadia, he took all of these Greek stories and myths as a little bit stupid. You know, he didn't quite buy what they were telling him. But now that he is in this place where there's actually not that much to see, but where every stone has a story and is connected to a goddess or a certain deity or a nymph, then he suddenly seems to change his mind somehow. And he spends long passages talking about certain wells or springs or mountains and how they connect to cult. And it seems that here he kind of grasped the inner or this interconnection between Greek religious customs and their landscapes and the stories that they told around them. And then it kind of turns into really this very interesting, what I refer to together with or drawing on Kate Rigby as a literature of response, where he responds to the sights he sees, to the stories he hears, and he draws these connections, these broad connections. And I think this is also to probably also come back to what we were talking about before. I think that this is also important, especially in our time now. I mean, as someone who is rooted a lot in the, I would say, in the community of the environmental humanities, which is growing ever stronger, but what worries me a little bit is that in the environmental humanities, there is a trend of focusing on the Anthropocene with a critical watershed around 1800. There's not many people in the environmental humanities that study the pre-modern world. And what gets lost sort of in this focus on modernity and the pressing issues and concerns of our era is that many of the central tropes and concepts that we actually have of nature and culture and the non-human, as it were, they come from antiquity. They don't, not just from the ancient Greek mythology, of course, also from Islam, from Christianity, from Judaism, and so on and so forth. And I mean, you mentioned Latour. He's a very good example. I mean, facing Gaia, you know, Gaia is very important to him. I mean, he criticizes Lovelock, of course, in his lecture series that he gave, but he also comes back to this sort of primordial Greek goddess of nature, and here he infuses actually his network theory also sometimes with this kind of I would say ecological religious kind of persona, whatever Gaia means. I mean, it's to me personally, it's not quite clear in how far he draws on the ancient world in this, but this is actually an example of, you know, these deep connections, but also, of course, the differences. And I think it's very important in for, you know, cultural ecology, but also literary ecology, and actually for the environmental humanities as a whole, to think these, on the one hand, these lines of tradition and deep time connection, long-term histories, together with with these central differences in the way we read the world now. But and this is my last sentence on this, I promise. I also recently Element, it's called. It's kind of a longer essay, and there I asked the question also somewhat provocatively: what is the place of the ancient anthropos in the Anthropocene? Because in the Anthropocene, so far, there's no place for the ancient anthropos. It's been sort of relegated completely to the sidelines, completely marginalized. And I think this is why it is very, very important, especially for people in the humanities, to go back and to look at the long-term sort of traditions. Where do our concepts come from? How can we update them? And probably also, going back to what Catherine has said in her introduction, how can we actually approach ancient cultures, ancient texts with this sort of in the back of our heads, but without doing it anachronistically? A sort of a critical dialogue, also as a kind of literature of response with regard to this textual canon.
Wonderful, thank you. I can feel now that I have to go back and read Latour again and look for Gaia. This is now that you mention it, I remember it, but I definitely have to go back. This is wonderful. Diana, please go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Lynn. Hi, Lynn. How are you? Do you think that Norwegian Jews have any of a different take on ecology and environmental issues than Norwegian, the typical Norwegian cultural view, which is obviously a little more informed by Christianity, but also has a strong secular thing? Do you see any extra thing going on being drawn?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that's what I tried to start to say in the beginning, that with a primarily secular outlook on life, as I see among most Jews and contemporary Jews, is that it's the same as everybody else. It's like, so some young people are probably more involved than others, and we're all doing our thing as Norwegians, but not as Jews. That's basically what I tried to say. That's why there is no Jewish ecology kind of movement or anything like that in the Jewish community. I mean, they're not in Oslo, not in Norway, but there is definitely places in Israel that are very concerned with those things. There are kibbutzim that are concerned with kosher, with ecology, and there are in America. That's where I met it, but not here. No, not unless they'd been in contact with the things that I was teaching when I was working as a rabbi from home.
Yeah, just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, so that I thought I clarified that in the beginning, but that's absolutely so. Thank you.
And just to follow up on that, Lynn, you mentioned how the eco-kosher movement has been strong in Israel and in the States. Do you think there is a potential in Norway for it to grow? And I mean, for the ecological movement in Norway to become more Jewish among Jews, if you understand what I mean by that.
I do not think so. I think it's more like more Jews will, I think young Jews are, they become vegan and vegetarian out of personal issues, but I don't think they connect it in a Jewish context. I mean, some might, but it's not a trend. It's not something that, and it, like I said, it's such a small environment. It's like, and a lot of Jews are Jewish without being connected to the, it hasn't even been a theme in the Jewish museums yet. Maybe it's about time.
You have to tell them that.
Yeah, I mean, I was involved with the exhibition there, so I had aspects of that showing this indigenous underlying part, and I think for me that's in itself. I think for some of the people that have been in contact with me, I think that gives a great aha, because it brings them to a kind of a down-to-earth kind of accept of, well, Judaism is what I make it into. It's not what the rabbis are telling me it should be. So it is a kind of a revolutionary in that way, that you listen to what is real for me rather than what is said by the authorities. So in that way, I think that kind of ecological thinking it's really also having, it's about pointing the, you know, the finger back to ourselves. What's right for me? What's authentic for me? What's in the context of that culture that I'm a part of? And I think that's true for all of us. Yeah.
Since the rabbi in Oslo is now taking youth groups, or was before COVID, to both Israel and to the US, which is interesting.
Yeah.
It became an issue for him, you know, if ecology was something of importance, because it is to the young people.
Exactly.
That might be, if he took them to places that actually explored that in both of those cultures, then the Norwegian youth might pick up and link into large, you know, more Jewish.
Exactly. So in that respect, it's the same with Islam. It depends on where are those leading figures in their consciousness journey. So I think, you know, so that's why I'm saying it all starts with our own consciousness journey and how we transmit that in our environments.
Indeed. Thank you all so much.